Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. Today we have on Adam Sandel. He's a philosopher, Guinness World Record holder for most pull-ups in 1 minute, and an award-winning teacher. He's the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Place of Prejudice, A Case for Reasoning Within the World. And Adam has taught at Harvard University and is currently an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn. His newest book, available now, is called Happiness in Action, A Philosopher's Guide to the Good Life. Welcome, Adam. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. So, usually we start off with a quote from a book, from the sort of guest book. So, but today I kind of want to start off with an anecdote. So Alan and I actually ended up going to a comedy show on Friday night, and I felt like it was super applicable to your work, or rather your work was super applicable to it. So we went to go see Ari Shafir, and Andrew Schultz was one of his guests. And so we're sitting in the show, and, we're enjoying it, obviously. And I'm thinking the whole time, like, oh my God, man, like this is the dumbest fucking thing in the world, right? So you have a bunch of people who paid to hear just really kind of brilliant and dumb jokes at the same time, right? And then so as I'm kind of thinking about it, I'm thinking like, oh my God, like what is it that this is? What's the purpose of this, right? Like what is this for? And so as the kind of night is going on, and we're actually like obviously enjoying it, and we're sort of talking to each other, whatever, the jokes or whatever are crude, but something like comedy doesn't really have much of a purpose. And so as I'm reading your book and I'm kind of applying it now to some of the I guess some of my life, right? I'm also wondering how many times do I actually give up on things that I shouldn't probably give up on, things that I could potentially enjoy. And so comedy to me was such a great example, because in this 2 hour period, it was just fun for like the sake of itself. And it was probably the dumbest fucking thing that we could do at that time for that money, So it's like, instead of doing something, productive, striving for something, maybe working on our podcast, so I'm a writer doing something like that. I was like, wow, man, we spent 2 hours, we spent a lot of money, but it was fun for the sake of itself, right? And then so as I'm reading your book, I'm thinking about, what is it that kind of stops us from doing that? And what is it that sort of makes us feel so guilty for enjoying something like a comedy show? So like, again, on the one hand, this thing was completely purposeless, right? So, apparently there's no like a social justice sort of a kind of aura to it.
Or it's not goal oriented.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So there's no like sort of social justice aspect to it. And it's not really getting us anywhere, right? So, Alan and I, we left that night, and then we woke up the next morning and nothing changed, right? Our lives were the same, and kind of we went on about them, right? But what is it about us, Adam, in obviously now going into your writing, what is it about us that makes it so kind of, again, makes us feel so guilty and makes us feel like, we have to have a life that's solely driven by purpose and goals?
Well, we live in a society that prides its goal orientation. I mean, just think about what consumes our daily lives: achievements, great and small, whether it's getting a promotion at work, or whether it's checking off boxes on the to-do list, or whether it's setting a personal best in a race or something. We're very goal oriented, and there's nothing wrong with goals per se, but the problem arises when we begin to define our self-worth by how close we are to achieving goals, and it consumes us. And what happens is we lose precisely the joy that you're describing, Leon, the joy of something for its own sake, activity for the sake of itself. And I think the comedy show is a great example. And events like that, at least momentarily, pull us out of this goal-oriented existence. And there's something quite liberating about them. You're just having fun, you're kicking it, you're laughing, sharing it with friends who you're there with. And in a certain sense, it's pointless. I think it's pointless in the sense that it's not goal-oriented, but I think we could say that there's a larger meaning to it. It's not meaningless. And I think the meaning comes from enjoying the jokes as windows onto the human condition and to our own experience. The best kind of jokes are the ones that highlight an aspect of our daily lives, sometimes an absurdity of our daily lives, and just put it into the right words that allow us to be self-reflective in a certain way, actually. So we're engaged, even if we don't really realize it, in the process of interpretation, even as we're sitting there in the comedy show. And I think there's something quite liberating about that, because it channels our intellect, our power to interpret the world in a different way, even though we're not consciously focusing on it necessarily. Self-deprecating humor is a type of humor I always like, and it there is something very freeing, liberating, because it often is making fun of mishaps, failures. But in doing so, in presenting those mishaps and failures in front of an audience in a funny way, it actually teaches us that failure can be the occasion for joy. And I think that's an important lesson.
Yeah. And, being goal oriented, it in itself, it's not a bad thing. Just the issue is that we sort of train ourselves to say, oh, I'll be happy when this goal is attained. Like, oh, when I have this job, I'm going to be happy. Oh, when I get married, when I have a girlfriend, when I have children, I'll be happy. I'll be happy when this happens, when that happens, right? And it's like we're training ourselves to never be happy in the now, right? And that's very interesting because it's like we're basically setting ourselves up to never get there, essentially. And I feel like that's the wrong way to sort of see things. Yeah.
Definitely. And what you realize is you're the same person. You have this lofty goal. Once I get married or once I land the dream job, somehow my life is going to be justified. It's all going to be so different than the crappy life I have now. Finally I'm going to be there, the promised land. And then you realize, no, I'm the same person. You carry yourself with you. And if you don't have some sense of self that you're bringing to those new situations, you're going to find that you're still stuck in the same framework.
Yeah. And then going back to the comedy show, there was this joke that Ari Shafir had about so it was essentially about, so here's the thing with him. I don't want to get into this too much because that's not really the point of our show, but the thing with him is like he says something that like sort of builds up enough tension where you're thinking he's about to say something horrifically offensive, and then he kind of pulls back and you're like, oh my god, wow, that's what he was going to say. It's like not offensive at all. That's hilarious, right? So that's what I really love about him. But he had this joke where he's talking about so he's talking about trans people, but he's talking specifically about female to male trans people, and essentially no, I'm sorry, male to female, that they essentially become competitors. And he was talking about the trans swimmer issue. So whatever, right? And you're thinking about this and you're going, okay, like, where is he going with this? And then the kind of punchline is like, yeah, well, I don't give a shit about like, what was it? He said, I didn't give a shit about like women's gymnastics or whatever, right? I didn't give a shit about like women's Olympic swimming, right? And it's sort
like,
of,
why is this a story?
yeah,
It was like, oh, like, why are we talking about like, I never cared about like amateur women swimming or something like that, which is, I thought that was hilarious because like I didn't even think he was gonna go there. We thought he was gonna go into some really offensive sort of place. We're like, oh crap, like where is he going with this? But yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So and my thinking about this was, like, so first of all, I feel a little bit guilty, right? So when I laughed at the joke, I laughed at it because there was a truth to it, right? So like we were just talking about, there's some truth in comedy, but it also made it okay for me to say like, yeah, honestly, I don't really care about this issue that much either, right? But of course, kind of the more social justice part of me says like, no, man, like you can't laugh at this stuff. You have to care about it. But again, that's sort of that goal-oriented sort of psyche that I have, or part of my psyche. And I think a lot of times when we think about, who we're supposed to be in the world, we have to care about like everything under the sun, right? So like, okay, so something like this, and I want to try to be as nuanced as possible about this, right? So I definitely care about trans rights. It's definitely an important issue to me. But like this specific issue, when he said that, I was like, yeah, I technically don't care. I was like, if people want to compete in this particular sport or they don't want to compete in that particular sport, I don't know, man, like just you guys figure it out. It doesn't really matter much to me. So I kind of love that because again, you're going back to comedy and it sort of allows you to just sort of be and to say like, okay, yes, this is a part of who I am. I care about some things and I care about some aspects of social justice, but not necessarily all of them. And so I really like that, going back into your book, is that there's a part of it that says like, dude, it's okay to chill out. It's okay to kind of be in a friendship, right? One aspect of it, which I would definitely want to get into. It's okay to be in a friendship and just to be in it for its own sake. That you guys aren't trying to make the world a better place. Like, even the friendship that I have with Alan, right? We're doing this podcast. Obviously, there's some aspect to it. But most of the time, we're just shooting the shit, man. We're just shooting the shit and talking about movies, comedy, whatever it is. And it's not really going anywhere. So yeah, Adam, can we kind of get into that and your conception of friendship and why it's sometimes okay for you to just be and just be friends with somebody for its own purpose?
Definitely. I think that friendship is a virtue. And I say virtue, we've lost the term virtue in describing friendship these days. For the ancient Greeks, friendship was considered a great virtue, something that actually wasn't so easy to maintain, that involved commitment and having somebody's back in situations that are tough. And I think we respect that ideal today, but I think we tend to lose this this connection to friendship in a highly goal-oriented society where we seek many allies to get this done or that done. Yep. A partner in it could be a social justice mission, trying to make the world a better place, or it could simply be a career goal, a personal goal, where we have a lot of connections, people we can talk shop with, but not friends in the genuine sense of people who we share a history with, whose back we have, and we know they have our back. And more than that, people who help us interpret our lives and make us the people who we are. So friendship in that sense is very easy to lose in a highly goal-driven mode of existence.
Right.
No, totally. Right. I mean, if you're in a sort of, I would say like a sort of a taker's orientation versus a giver's orientation, right? Like, okay, what can I get from you? What can you do for me? Right? Like you forge these alliances hoping to get something from them, right? But I mean, when you come from sort of a giver's orientation, you actually forge bonds with somebody who, like you said, has your back, who might listen to you if you have some sort of an issue, or you do vice versa. Have great times with them as well. And these are some of the aspects of life that are arguably the most important, right? It's going for what somebody can do for you just so you can sort of further yourself. There is some kind of a use to that. I suppose, don't get me wrong, but I don't want to throw it out completely. But it's definitely, it kind of sucks the air out of what's really meaningful and might contribute to legitimate happiness,
Right.
genuine happiness.
Right. And by the way, and just to add on to that, doesn't it also kind of seem like sort of there's a contradiction or a juxtaposition between sort of happiness and striving? Because every time we are striving, I mean, we're very rarely happy at the same time. So is that kind of what you're saying too, Adam?
Yes, and the more we strive, the more we lose what attracted us to the activity in the first place. I think this is a universal experience where you start to do something because you genuinely love to do it. It could be taking up a sport, it could be writing or playing a musical instrument, whatever. What attracts you to it is the intrinsic beauty of it, the challenge of it that's thrilling in the moment as you're engaging in it. But then you begin to ask yourself, well, how good am I compared to that other guy? And you begin to define your own enjoyment in terms of how close you are to a goal, in terms of some ranking or whatnot. And that really detracts from the intrinsic joy of the activity. And it stops us from considering, well, what is it about that activity that initially drew me to it? Why is this a special thing in the total context of my life? And I think that mode of thought, trying to interpret, trying to place things together, trying to piece together the various aspects of our life into a coherent whole, is such an important thing and is of the essence of self-possession. And I think that we lose that when we just focus on achieving goals.
Mm-hmm. And what is self-possession? Like how would you define that?
I would distinguish it from self-confidence. I think that's the best way to get at it. Self-confidence would be feeling yourself capable of accomplishing a particular task, or in a particular domain you feel in command because you're used to doing it, because you have a certain expertise, a certain knowledge, and you're confident. Self-possession, as I understand it, is something deeper and more comprehensive. It has to do with the way you carry yourself in everything that you do. It has to do with how you face uncertainty, failure, even disaster. How are you able to piece together your life when things fall apart? And I think it requires a kind of narrative sensibility, understanding your life as a journey that is connected to people and places that forms a kind of horizon of intelligibility, who you are, where you're going, so that you can incorporate losses, you can bounce back, you can reinterpret things. I think self-possession also has to do with embracing a spirit of adventure. As strong a sense of self as you have, you recognize that there's more to your life than you can possibly know or foresee at any given moment. So embracing the mysterious, the unknown, the beyond.
Yeah.
And so that's how I would describe it, in contrast to self-confidence, which is very much goal-oriented, or kind of limited to a certain realm.
What would you say is a sort of like a pitfall on the way to being able to see this sort of horizon, or like this overarching perspective of your life? Because there's this one part in the book, it's actually somewhere near the beginning, to be fair. It's about the ego, and how it sort of derives
Wait, actually, I'll read the quote. I
Oh, you
will.
have it?
I will actually read the quote. Yeah, because this is actually a really great quote. Yeah, so that's where I was going to go. So actually,
Oh, that's
pause, and I will read it. All right. So Adam wrote in his book,
okay.
as we will see throughout our investigation of self-possession, friendship, and engagement with nature, we find the meaning of life when we are immersed in activity for its own sake. When we aren't turned inward, scrutinizing our thoughts and emotions, or turn outward toward the finish line of some project. To be so immersed is to overcome the distinction between in my mind and out there. For what I face, so to speak, in the midst of activity is nothing but my very self, a self that is at the same time a world. What we take to be the ego or subjective consciousness that so often intrudes in daily life, drawing comparison to others, separating itself from what it does and what it uses, worrying that things might fall apart, turns out to be a derivative reality subordinate to the enacted story expressed in the flow of activity.
Yeah. By the way, I love that. I love that so much. It's worded in such a beautiful way too. Like it's like, oh, it creates a derivative reality. That's great, because it places this picture in your mind of like, no, there's actual reality with a capital R, and there's something like your consciousness. Sorry, your ego is essentially creating a small aspect, arguably a false sort of narrative of like millions of different variables that could be taken into consideration. And I don't know, how can somebody maybe understand better how to sort of navigate the ego in order to become more sort of self-possessive or possessing?
Yeah, I think attentiveness to what captivates you in the world around you in your daily life, that often you look at, you notice for a moment, beautiful sunrise or something that catches your attention, that if you just dwelled on it for a moment and began to think about it and try to make sense of why it captivates you, what's so beautiful about it, how would you share it with your wife at the end of the day, or with a good friend? I think that's where to start. These things pull us out of ourselves, if by self we mean a kind of self-conscious, self-conscious reflection, or the ego.
Sure.
And we come to realize that who we are isn't simply an individual ego, but rather somebody who's open to a world that presents itself with certain meanings to be interpreted. And that in the process of interpreting them, we grow as people, so that whatever person we start with isn't the person who we end up being, after we set ourselves to thinking and engaging with the things around us. So I think attentiveness, and of course the enemy to that kind of attentiveness is the pressure of the workday. You got to move on, you got to make breakfast, pack your bags, and get on the bus or whatever. So I think just taking the time, and it doesn't have to be a lot in the practice of our daily lives, just to stop for a second and think and interpret. And that pulls us out of this kind of self-conscious reflection. Perhaps the experience that I was trying to express in that quote that you read is best captured from my own perspective when I'm engaged in intense athletic activity. Believe it or not, that this kind of being in the moment, being in the flow. Like when I'm in the midst of a hard training session of pull-ups, training to set a record, or just, training with a buddy of mine, just for the sake of it, because we love to train, and you're in the middle of the set, you're trying to get your chin over the bar that one final time, and it's very intense, and you're taken outside of yourself but also returned to yourself. And by that I mean you come to understand yourself as a force that is working with your surroundings at the same time as you're struggling. So the force of gravity that's pulling you down, but you realize that's also the same force that's giving you the grip on the bar and that's allowing you to rebound upward for one more rep. So it's not like gravity is this external force entirely. It's a partner in a shared activity. So you're at one with nature, but at the same time, you're appropriating nature within your activity. And you could bring friendship into that too. Your training partners shouting encouragement, come on, you got this, one more rep. And so there is a kind of community. Who you are in that moment is not just an isolated individual. It's not the person who's thinking, oh, am I going to succeed? Am I going to fail? It's not the person who's thinking, okay, well, this is one training session, and then next week I'm going to have another and try to get one more rep. And then maybe 8 weeks from now, I'll be ready to, test my max or something like that. No, all of that vanishes in the midst of this intense activity, and you realize a very different connection to the world. And that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, and I love the kind of personal aspect of it. So, what makes this so interesting to me now, going into kind of the athletic part of your life, is that you sort of see how unstable all of it is. So, I remember so I'm a writer, and I remember when I was sort of striving to be published, and I'm thinking, once I finally get published, like at this particular publication, I'm finally going to make it, right? This is going to sort of be it for me. And then once that happened, it was nice for like a couple of days, and people are like, oh my God, like this is so cool or whatever. People would share my work, whatever. They would leave me good comments, feedback, etc. And then after a while, I'm like, oh, cool. I'm pretty much back to where I started. So I love that you use the example of the pull-up record, because essentially you get it and then you lose it. And then you try to get it again, and then you lose it again, right? So what you're seeing at that time is fundamentally is that there's no such thing as an endpoint. And as we're striving for goals, because nature is so kind of, it's fluctuating all the time, is that there's no such thing as like an endpoint. And so, Adam, can you tell us a little bit about kind of your personal experience now and how that informed your philosophy?
So I set this record back in 2016 for the first time, most pull-ups in a minute. And back then I got 51. The previous record was 50. And I was thrilled. I didn't know how long it was going to stand, but what I didn't realize was that just, I think a couple months later, two people broke it in succession. Someone got 53 and then someone got 54. And these were, a guy from Italy and a guy from Bulgaria. So all of a sudden, that great accomplishment, that I had worked so hard to achieve was just eclipsed. And so I said, okay, well, what is there to do but try for it again? And, I was motivated certainly by the record. I'm not going to say that the competition didn't inspire me, but I just love training and doing pull-ups. I've always loved sports, always been very active, and it's been a part of my life. So why not? I love doing it, train. Okay, 55. That stood. I was able to get 55, then that stood until someone else broke that. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to get 60 in 60 seconds. It's going to be, my greatest accomplishment yet. And it's just such a cool thing to say. I can do 60 pull-ups in 60 seconds. And I was able to get 61. And
Damn.
yeah, and I said, like, I sort of said that to myself, like, damn, that was good, pat yourself on the back. I didn't think I or many of the other competitors had much more in the tank than 61. And then a guy got 62.
Wow.
And yeah, this was a kind of a cool thing, and this is what brought my own pull-ups chase to a little bit of public attention. It was a guy with an amazing story. He was a national wrestling champion, and he had won the NCAA wrestling championships only having one leg, which
Wow.
was to me an
Oh.
astounding achievement. And he took up pull-ups, and he he got 62 shortly after I'd gotten 61. He had been following my record, and I felt kind of honored that this athlete who had risen to national prominence, ESPN had done a piece on him, had taken interest in this rather niche record pursued. And so it got it got some public attention because he had done his attempt at like halftime at the Jets game or something. And
Wow.
I was like, wow, okay, so let's keep it going. You got to start training again. And I was, so then fast forward a couple months, I was able to get 68.
Wow. Wow. That seems pretty, yeah. I'm sure you thought that that was impossible at the time.
Your perspective changes.
Mm.
Seeing is believing. You see other athletes do something that you thought wasn't possible, and then it just changes your whole paradigm. And then you say, well, I can do that too. And of course, there's a certain limit to that. Like, who knows? Tomorrow we might wake up and someone gets like 85 pull-ups, and I'm like, okay, I can't. I'm not going to be able to do that. I know my limits. Like,
Right. Right.
maybe the current record is 74, by the way.
Wow.
Guy from China. So yeah, I held it for 2 years, about at 68. Then a guy from China reached 74 in 2020. And since then I've been trying to get it back, but not yet, but someday soon, maybe I will.
Well, you know what this makes me think of? So the parable of the Chinese farmer. I don't know. Have you guys heard of it? Oh, so okay. So the parable of the Chinese farmer goes like this. So essentially, a Chinese farmer loses his horse, right? So his neighbors come to him and they say, "Oh my God, this is so terrible. We can't believe you lost your horse," right? And he says, "I don't know. We'll see." The next day, so the horse returns, and the horse returns with another horse, a wild horse. The neighbors come back to the farmer and they say, "Oh my God, it was actually a blessing. This is amazing." The farmer says, "Yeah, I don't know. We'll see." The next day, the new horse, the wild horse, ends up throwing his son off of it, right? So the son breaks his leg, and then the neighbors come back and they're like, no, actually, we were wrong. This was a terrible thing. Oh my God, this horse was like evil, right? Or it's like cursed or whatever. And the farmer says, yeah, I don't know. We'll see. The next day, there's a conscription. And now, so people within the age limit, whatever it is, 18 to 24, now they're sort of taken into the army and they have to fight in this war against, some other kind of clan or whatever. But the kid doesn't have to go to war because he has a broken leg. The neighbors again come back and they're like, oh my God, actually, we were wrong. This was this great thing. And of course, the Chinese farmer again says, I don't know. We'll see. So the point of the story, as I'm sure you guys already can gather, is that like we're terrible at predicting, right? We are so bad at predicting what will make us happy. We're so bad at predicting the future, and yet we think we know what will make us happy. So what I love about this philosophy and this way of like looking at life and of being is essentially, first of all, number one, we're missing out on so much by not being in the moment and by not enjoying what's in front of us. That's obviously, in this case, obvious. But then the second thing is that we don't even know what will make us happy. So like I said, I thought, oh my God, being published, here's this thing that's going to finally make me feel like I've made it, even though I still don't feel like I've made it. And this goes back to the work of Ken and Sheldon, who we had on several months ago, and I really love this. He says, and he has a whole chapter on this in his book on free will. He says, yeah, we're notoriously terrible at predicting what will make us happy. So, we kind of have these goals, right? And we think, okay, once I reach X, Y, and Z, I'm going to finally be happy. And again, like I did, I will feel like I've made it. But, going back to this parable of the Chinese farmer, why it's so timeless is that because it essentially tells you when you look at what's good and you look at what's bad, be really, really careful about appearances because oftentimes they're deceptive. So this thing that seems terrible on the surface might actually somehow end up being a good thing. And this thing that seems really great, like again, me being a published writer, might not necessarily be a bad thing, but at the very least, it's not going to make you as happy. So what Kennan says and what his studies show is that let's say if somebody predicts, let's say, doing X is going to make me happy at a 10, right? We often find that it'll make you happy at like about a 5 or a 6, which is nice. But even still, again, the question is really, and this is what I want to talk to you about, Adam, is why are we so willing to sacrifice the present and the things, again, like nature, friendship, or whatever for these broad term goals that, probably won't make us as happy? Would you say there's ignorance involved? maybe some self-deception? What is it sort of that makes us so willing to sacrifice for the now, or rather the now for the future?
Well, I think it's an abiding human tension, an age-old tension between accomplishment and activity for its own sake. I don't think it's peculiar necessarily to life today, but what I would add is that I think we are influenced very deeply by philosophies that arose in early modern times and during the Enlightenment that define human life in terms of moving towards some grand goal. I mean, the very concept of enlightenment, coming out of the dark ages and finally attaining wisdom once and for all, wisdom that will liberate us from scarcity, that will allow us to conquer nature, wisdom that will allow us to build a just society once and for all, to eliminate exploitation from the world. These powerful ideas that arose during the Enlightenment, I think, deeply influence us today, so that when we think of what it means to be a real agent in the world, we think of being an agent of progress. And we define progress in all different ways: technological progress, social justice progress, economic progress. So you could define progress however way you want, but you're imagining life as moving towards some grand state of affairs that will be decisively better than now. And I think these philosophies that developed in early modern times and during the Enlightenment just have a great hold on us, so that we think what it means to be a responsible, active person who lives a fulfilling life is to live in service of these grand goals. And I think that's a mistake. And I think what ancient philosophy recognizes, and that what gets lost in modern times, is the instability of all achievement, of all accomplishment. And you see this in a very, very small way when I speak about the pull-ups and the records being broken and all that, but you can look at it in a very large sense on a societal level. You know, the Roman Empire was the greatest thing until it crumbled and fell, and human achievement is fragile. And even our greatest achievements, technological, societal, economic, are, I mean, and we do see it today even, that institutions are vulnerable to decay, and the world is open to disruptive forces that we can't predict: natural disaster, sudden political upheaval. So what I believe the Greeks recognized was that these disruptive forces aren't just things that ultimately we can eradicate from existence once we get smarter and more enlightened and kind of more in touch with a universal sensibility. No, these forces are endemic to existence and to the human condition. So how do you live in the face of uncertainty and disruption? How do you live in a world where the just often suffer and the unjust prevail? And you have stories like Oedipus, you know, great Greek tragic stories that ultimately, I would say, point to the need for a redemptive spirit. And that's the background against which friendship is so important, because in a world that's constantly vulnerable to disruption, you need friends, not simply allies, because your allies are only going to be as good as that goal, remains a goal. But your friends are going to be the ones who pick you up and who help redeem you when things fall apart. So you ask why today it's so difficult for us to realize the virtue of friendship, to be self-possessed in this kind of grander sense. And I think it is because of these philosophies that have their grip on us, whether we realize it or not.
Is one of those philosophies Stoicism? Because I know in the book you talk about how Stoicism is somewhat passive, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Could you speak on that a bit? Yeah.
Yes, I think Stoicism has an immense appeal precisely in contrast to the goal-oriented way of life that we've been discussing, and that can be so damaging. That Stoicism tells us to have a measured distance from our goals and our accomplishments. I think one great thing about Stoicism is it specifically it brings us face to face. I'll put it that way. It brings us face to face with the fragility of achievement and of human life. But it does so in a way that I think is ultimately too passive and self-effacing. And I think it is an excuse sometimes for quiescence, or for just stepping back and not doing a whole lot about all the crap that's going on around you. And I think one way of getting at this is Stoicism demotes friendship. Friendship's not bad, of course, according to Stoicism, but according to one popular Stoic author, and I think this represents the Stoic view of friendship quite well, is he calls friendship a preferred indifferent.
Wait, is this Massimo or David?
Massimo.
Yeah.
Friendship's preferred indifferent. It's something that we would rather have, but if we don't have it, that's okay too. We can be indifferent to it. And to me, there's something cold and misguided about that philosophy, actually, that a life without friendship is a life that's missing something. And I think the problem with Stoicism is that it's too guarded almost. And, your friendship's great, but, friendships fall apart. Your friend might betray you, so don't get too attached. But it doesn't do it for me. And I think for a lot of people, if they really considered the implications of that, they would be more hesitant to embrace Stoicism.
It's like a lack of commitment, essentially, right? If you're only, it's kind of like doing something half-assed in a way, right? Like, this person might betray me one day, so I'm going to keep some distance from them, so as not to become so attached that if something bad happens, I will suffer for it.
Right.
Instead, it's like, if I'm getting it right, you commit to them so fully, so like literally at 100%, to the point where you will both get the best version of that relationship. And yes, it can fail potentially, but not going at it 100%. You miss the richness of that bond.
Yeah, and I want to add on to that. So we also had on Brian Van Norden a couple of times, and shout out to him. And we talked about Confucianism. So what's so interesting about this is that, so on the one hand, something like Stoicism, well, here's the counter argument, and I actually would disagree with the counter argument to what you're saying. I actually agree with you. So the counter argument in the Stoic perspective is like, well, if I'm working toward being a good person, then I'm ultimately going to be a good friend, right? So who cares how attached I am to you? So this is why I bring up Brian, right? So Brian would say, well, but that's kind of like unnatural, right? So Confucius would actually argue that we're going to treat our friends and family in a little bit more of a special way than when we would treat the outsider, right? So the Stoic perspective, in my understanding, is that, well, I'm just a good person to everybody, and I'm not really attached to anybody specifically. So, from my perspective, let's say if I'm friends with let's say you're a Stoic, right? And, Alan's like really nice to me, and he's doing all these great things. My first thought was like, oh, wow, Alan really likes me. He wants to be my friend. And then I see him with everybody else, and I'm like, oh, he's just a fucking Stoic, and it kind of takes away some of that specialness. So why I love Confucianism and why I kind of appreciated Brian's perspective so much was because I felt like it was more human. So yes, of course, you're going to want to be a good person to everybody, but in terms of degrees, you're going to probably treat your friends a little bit better or in a little bit more of a special way than you would like, your stranger or your average person. So again, going back to Stoicism, I think there's something great there about, being this great person. And yes, ultimately, if you're just nice to everybody and you're treating everybody with courtesy, but ultimately you're going to be a decent person and people are going to like you. But there's not going to be that special bond that gets the person to say, oh, wow, this thing that Alan does for me, he probably wouldn't do for most people.
Yeah, and I think Stoicism tends to destroy individuality to some extent, because what makes somebody a good friend is that they're, in some sense, a good fit for you, that we're not all the same. The common ground that we share is something that we forge out of our particular life experiences, and we can draw analogies, very powerful analogies, that allow us to form very deep friendships. But what Stoicism does is it says, well, all human beings are basically the same. We have rational capacities. We can think, we can perceive. This is worthy of respect. We should just respect humanity kind of in the abstract equally. But what that abstract perspective misses is the actual texture of life. And I've always thought that to love humanity, which is a fine goal, but to love humanity, you have to love the people closest to you, because otherwise, what does love even mean? How do you even know what it means to treat somebody else well? How do you understand them as a person similar to you, who is worthy of the same consideration and the same respect as you and your family and your friends? Well, that consideration and respect has to be learned from within your inner circles. And then you can say, oh yeah, that person who lives on the other side of the world, they have a family like I do, or they have friends just as I have friends. So it's not as though we can appreciate them separate from our own particular friendships. We build outward. And I think the Stoic perspective that sees the more particular relationships as something kind of tribal and kind of backward might be too strong, but less significant than a kind of generalized love for humanity. I think it has things backwards.
It's sort of, there's a sense of duty there. And I think that's what really doesn't appeal to so many people. And again, in a way, it's a good thing, right? Because duty fosters civilization, society, or whatever. We want to know that other people are not going to actively or want to hurt us, right? Maybe sometimes they will. But I think the point is that we want to know that, like, again, going back to like my friendship with Alan, I want to know that he does nice things for me because he cares about me, not because he thinks it's like his sacred duty or he's being a good Stoic or
It's
whatever.
my sacred duty.
Right. He's being a good Stoic, right? And I think that's sort of the big turnoff for people, even though not to just, shit on Stoicism, because it has very many great aspects. We've had Massimo on several times. He's phenomenal wisdom, has so much to offer, and especially in terms of that philosophy. But yeah, man, I mean, the downside is like this sort of lack of an emotional perspective, or this part of it that sort of like kind of feels like it's missing. So Adam, in your book now, you talk about Aristotle, and you say, we talk about Socrates and Plato. So what is it that you think that they have to offer that the Stoics maybe might have missed?
Well, Socrates is a good example here. Socrates, I think, is a model of self-possession from which we can learn. And well, he has a kind of oppositional stance toward the city of Athens. The city of Athens condemns him to death for corrupting the youth by leading them to question conventional wisdom. And instead of telling the jury of Athenian citizens who's going to condemn him, okay, I'll stop doing what I'm doing, I'll stop stirring the pot, he says, no, the unexamined life is not worth living. And that's one of his famous lines. So he represents a kind of oppositional figure on the one hand, and he's in opposition to the conventional authority, to the authority of the state, which is the kind of quintessential oppositional stance. But at the same time, and this is what makes Socrates so interesting, is that he believes he's the genuine educator of the people of Athens. So he basically says, the reason I'm not going to stop doing philosophy is because I think that through philosophy, I make myself better, I make the citizens of Athens better. And so he in that way represents the self-possessed individual who's not simply a rebel, but somebody who believes that he's fulfilling the genuine mission of what a real statesman should do.
Mhm.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So, I don't want to interrupt you. So, okay. And then in terms of what Socrates would say about, let's say, how these sort of three concepts or constructs intertwine, because, you talk about a lot about, well, you talk about that in your book. So the idea is that essentially when you're fostering one, or when you're improving on one, let's say you're improving on self-possession, right? You're automatically improving on the other, like friendship. So you have these three, right? So you have kind of the immersion in nature, or the sense of oneness in some sense, however you want to kind of phrase that, with reality. And then you have self-possession and friendship, right? So, and the idea is that our minds tend to kind of sense categories or create categories, but for you the idea is sort of it's like you're holding on a little bit loosely, but obviously not letting go, like the song goes, where the idea is all of these three are intertwined. So can we talk a little bit about that, and if Socrates actually talked about that as well?
Well, he demonstrated it in the way that
Mhm.
he lived. So self-possession and friendship, I think, come together in Socrates, because his self-possession had to do with standing up for philosophy. But what was philosophy for Socrates? It wasn't just thinking alone by himself, spinning ideas around in his own head. It was engaging in dialogue with other citizens from all walks of life, rich, poor, aristocrats, slaves. He spoke to everybody, and he was interested in their opinions on all of the topics that he wanted to discuss: the meaning of justice, the meaning of beauty, and the meaning ultimately of a good life. And so his activity that motivated him and that gave him the strength to stand up against the city was an activity that was inherently friendly, in the sense that he was in dialogue with people, and a kind of dialogue that wasn't simply trying to refute their position, but rather was trying to reach a common truth through discussion. And that's a very powerful model of friendship, mutual empowerment through self-examination and dialogue, where you both come out wiser.
Mhm.
And so self-possession and friendship couldn't be separated in the person of Socrates. I think that's a very powerful model, because today I think we regard self-possession and friendship as kind of two different virtues. Maybe both are important to living a good life, but we don't see the way that they're connected. And the reason we don't see it is because we understand the self in individualistic terms, so that standing up for yourself as an individual doesn't necessarily mean you're a good friend. You could also be a good friend, but somebody who's not easily swayed by the fashions of the day, who stands his own ground, that sort of thing. Maybe not the person with a lot of friends. But actually, what we miss is that if we reflect closely, I think, on our greatest acts of self-possession, what we will find is that we have exemplars who motivate us to be that way. We have certain activities that define who we are, that can't be understood except in partnership with other people,
Mhm.
that allow us to take a stand and to defy conventional wisdom. And so I think it's important to see those two together. And I think Socrates is one very clear example of how friendship and self-possession go together. And then as far as engagement with nature, I see that as connected as well with self-possession and friendship. Now, for Socrates, this notion of engagement with nature was not something that it was so explicit, because the ancient Greeks understood nature in very different terms than we do. Nature wasn't something that was simply out there, external to us, but nature was ordered in a way to express what was best. Nature was conceived of as a well-ordered arrangement, a cosmos that was ordered according to the good. So self-possession, understanding the good life for yourself, and understanding of nature, the movement of the planets, the arrangement of things, was one and the same, because both your own life was oriented to the good, and also nature as a whole was structured according to the good.
Mm-hmm.
Today, in modern times, we don't have that sensibility. At least it's not the first thing we think about when we think of nature. We think of modern physics, mechanism, forces that govern us blindly. It's not as if nature is ordered to express some idea or to present a model for how to live. It's just blind forces. That's how we think in modern terms. At least that's the most familiar way of conceiving nature. And so there is a kind of disconnect that we face as modern human beings between ourselves, human life, and nature. The path of the stars, the force of the wind, the change of the seasons, that's all stuff that happens external to us. If we weren't here, that would still be going on. Nature is this thing that is separate from us. But I think it's actually short-sighted to see nature in that way. That if we're attentive to nature, and by nature I mean nature as it first appears to us, the visible, tangible world, we will notice that in the rising and setting of the sun, in the movement of the stars, in the way the breeze blows through trees, the way that animals move and live and exist, we actually find models for how to interpret our own lives. And we do this all the time, very casually. So-and-so is as ferocious as a lion. We draw analogies, we draw metaphors from nature. And part of what I'm trying to recover in the book is an attentiveness to nature as a resource of meaning, and not simply as some external force that acts on us. And trying to pay attention to the ways in which we can engage with nature as interpreters or as partners in discussion, much along the lines of how Socrates would engage with a partner in discussion who presented some opposition. He would often have people challenge him and argue against his view of justice, and Socrates would argue back. But he would argue back by trying to work from within that person's perspective and try to show that person why, if they really thought it through, they would ultimately agree with him. And so I think we can do a similar thing with nature, and we do it. We just have to notice it, like when we harness the wind in a sail, and you have you really respond to the wind. The wind isn't something that you control, but it's something you respond to, and it's something that you can channel, and it's something that you can make manifest in a way that the wind itself, without you capturing it in the sail, wouldn't do. So that there is this human relation to nature that I believe is important, fundamental, actually, to self-possession, that we really need to recover today.
No.
That makes me think. So, in terms of engagement with nature, does this sound like engaging with nature? I'll present an example. Let's say I'm outside and I see some birds flying by, and instead of me maybe mentally labeling them as, oh, those are some birds. I mean, not that I would actually mentally label it this way, but let's say, yeah,
Those are birds.
okay. But instead of, I suppose, mentally labeling it, right, just sort of observing them, or maybe observing the sun setting, right, and kind of really sort of taking it in, as opposed to doing any sort of mental labeling. Is that also sort of engagement with nature, in the sense that it's kind of like you're coming from a non-dual consciousness, like it's not like self and other? Because like when you could mentally, I suppose you could mentally label something in a you don't necessarily have to be mentally labeling something, and I suppose to be coming from ego, right? I'm sure there's a way to do it where you're still coming from that sort of non-dualistic way of looking at things. But I suppose when you're not mentally labeling, you're not reducing something to something finite, right? Like you're kind of there with it. Is that kind of an example of engaging with nature?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of some examples from my own life. Well, here's one, and I do mention this one in the book. One day I was coming back from a run, hard run, and it was middle of the summer, and it wasn't a very good one. You have those days when you work out and it's a grind and you don't hit the times that you wanted to. Again, the goal-oriented perspective crops up and bums you out that you didn't do what you wanted.
Yep.
I was jogging home and I saw something, a very ordinary sight, but that for some reason in that mood struck me. It was a big tree. I think it was an oak tree that had been cut down, but sawed clean at the base, so that you have the massive trunk, and then you can see the rings of the tree. And from the middle of the sawed off trunk, there were all of these shoots coming up, like the tree was growing back suddenly. And in my kind of post-run, like, I would say, I don't know if stupor is the right word. It wasn't a stupor because I was attentive in a different way to the world. That, I wasn't harried, I wasn't rushing around, I wasn't trying to get to work. So I stopped for a second and I said, wow, this is amazing. Someone just cut this tree down, probably to clear a new bike path or whatever. And a few weeks later, look, it's already growing back. And I just imagine how tall this thing must have been. And these arrogant human hands chop it down, and here it's growing up. And there is a kind of appreciation that is relevant to your own life. It's not like that tree is exactly separate from you, because you can interpret it as a model for how to live yourself. Well, I got cut down, not that bad, but I got cut down by that workout. But look at this tree that happened to be right in my path, telling me I can bring myself right back up. New life, rebirth. And we get that when we're attentive to nature. So what we learn, I think, is that nature is not simply external to us, but something that draws us in, that has something to teach us, but that forces us to draw the lesson for ourselves. It's not going to speak for itself. We have to engage in the process of interpreting it. And that's the attitude that I'm trying to capture, and to say that I think it's really important for living a good life.
Right. And I love that, because nature teaches us so much about harmony and discord. So if you look at conflicts, whatever else, I mean, not just amongst humans, but even amongst animals, I mean, it's horrendous, right? It's sort of like sort of repugnant, right, to our sights. If you're seeing, prides of lions sort of killing other ones, especially killing cubs or whatnot. And what's so interesting is that when we get into dialogues or debates or whatever, we try to kind of defeat other people. And sort of in terms of learning from nature, right, you kind of see that nature teaches us in terms of not just like the cosmos or whatever, about sort of the beauty of harmony, right? But it's just nature itself, like the kind of environments that we find ourselves in. Harmony always kind of overrides and supersedes discord, yet somehow the sort of fundamental part of us consistently goes toward discord. So what I love about Alan, because he's so good about this, is that anytime there's sort of an argument, so I'm actually a little bit more combative than he is, but Alan tries really hard to see another person's perspective. And I think what he's so good at is that forward thinking, and in terms of cultivating harmony. So he sees that, okay, if I'm like just fighting with this person, even if I win this argument, probably isn't going to get me much in terms of like this friendship. Maybe I won't even necessarily convince him. What is that going to do for the broader group, et cetera, right? So he's so good at doing this, where he looks at, I don't know if it's nature essentially that's taught you this, but you're so good at sort of fostering harmony in a way where everybody wins. So that's what I've always appreciated about you.
Yeah, no, yeah. So, I mean, in an argument, or not even an argument, if for some reason somebody sees themselves as opposed to me, or has or they have an alternate perspective, I try to see if I can basically steel man it, right? Like, say back to them what I think that they're saying to me, and see if then, by restating what they said, if at that point they'll feel like they're understood, then I can sort of put my perspective out there, and then maybe we can integrate that to come to some sort of understanding. Also, in relation to friendship, I mean, if for some reason I have a genuine disagreement with someone, I do weigh it against, like I look at this argument as, this is the argument, like this small nothingness. And then the friendship is I should get that let's say this big, right? And then I'm like, should I really, just for this, allow that to interrupt like this giant relationship that we have or could have, and then going into the future and all of that. So I mean, yeah, I totally coming to some sort of understanding and not necessarily viewing somebody else as necessarily your opponent. I mean, we have that natural tendency, right? I mean, part of the aspect of the ego, right, is to you identify with your belief or your thought, and anything that is that deviates from that makes you feel a discomfort, almost as if like you're, I mean, metaphorically dying, I suppose, and you're trying to survive and keep this argument or this perspective alive.
It's your self-esteem dying, yeah.
But I mean, once you can actually see that that's like a fragment of who you are, or that argument or that perspective or identity isn't necessarily who you are, and this concept of self and other is just kind of like,
yeah, that's it. That's
yeah.
it. That's nature, right? And isn't that kind of what nature teaches us? Like, when you look at the ocean, right? The ocean is so much bigger than our stupid little petty squabbles.
Sure.
Yeah. So Adam, sort of, yeah, what are your kind of thoughts on that in terms of like argumentation and obviously sort of people falling into it, and essentially what nature can teach us about harmony?
Well, I think that nature can provide immense perspective on the petty squabbles. As you said, you mentioned the ocean. The other image I have is a gigantic waterfall. I went to the Iguazu Falls in Brazil, on the border of Brazil and Argentina. It's one of the largest waterfalls in the world, and it's a very humbling experience. And it makes you think, wow, what does this all mean? What can it? Why do I feel such awe in the presence of the waterfall? And the just the juxtaposition, I think, of the calmness of the waters right above it, and then they start to rush a little more and then suddenly crash and fall off and then maintain their serenity again. It's a lot of very much along the lines of what you're saying. It's quite a powerful model of how life is vulnerable to this sudden crash, when you least expect it, but then the waters keep flowing on, and it instills a sense of peace at the same time as it presents this terrible fate, so to speak. And so, yeah, I think nature is infinitely rich with these kind of examples that we can learn from if we only take the time.
Right. I love that. And it's sort of like life kind of teaches you in some ways through the waterfall that you should probably move on, kind of like the water, and it's like life also moves on, whether or not you're pissed off about something somebody said to you. It sort of just keeps going. So you can kind of go with it, or you can in some ways resist and say, no, I want to try to change this person, or I want to try to change the past, which obviously doesn't really get us much or doesn't get us too far. All right.
Yes.
Go for it.
Yes. In terms of attentiveness, right? So let's say in the example of, let's say, doing pull-ups or working out, or maybe engaging in some other action, is the main point, I suppose, in order to actually feel that happiness in action, so to speak, to just be as focused and as immersed as possible in that action, and then essentially it's kind of a waypoint into that happiness. Is that kind of the message?
Yes. Yeah, that's the idea. And then afterward, you can interpret it and you can carry it with you through your interpretations. But when you're in the midst of it, it draws you in so thoroughly that it's not even a conscious process. But you can preserve it. You can keep it going long after the workout is over by reflecting later what that experience means, and be ready then to apply that same flow state, oneness, to other parts of your life.
I love that. All right. So, we've gone over an hour, so that is such a great end off point. So, Alan, final questions for Adam before we wrap up?
Yes. If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course, buy the book, where can we do that?
Well, you can buy the book, Happiness in Action, on Amazon. you can, or at your local bookstore, hopefully. Barnes and Noble has, I know that. And you can follow me at on Instagram. That's my main social media platform. It's devoted primarily, or actually exclusively, to pull-ups, and pull-ups, muscle-ups, and athletic stuff. But for anybody who's interested in that, you can follow me at professor.pullups.
I love it. Adam, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Was
This was
awesome.
stellar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks, guys.
Absolutely, man. We'll be in touch with you soon.
Great. Look
All
forward.
right. See ya.
Awesome. All right. So, everyone, if you want to follow us, you could follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter. We're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.